I always like to start promptly, so here we go again. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you again. I hope you're all keeping well and enjoying the sunshine. I'm delighted this afternoon that we've got, as you know, Leslie Pollock presenting to us. Leslie was one of the founder members of SAGE, so he's been in it since day one. But I think this is the first time that we've had one of the committee members actually do a full presentation like this. So Leslie, you're first, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. Just to remind everybody what it is about, Leslie poses the question, were the children of Israel ever slaves in Egypt? His title is The Archaeology of the Exodus, and the questions he asks as well, were the plagues myths or miracles? Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Is there any archaeological evidence to support the Torah? And Leslie's now going to give us answers to all of these questions. So Leslie, over to you.
Does that work? Can everybody hear me?
I can.
I can't hear you. Can
yeah, no, go on, Leslie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart. It's nice to be the guinea pig for the SAGE committee. I would start off with a couple of provisos. Firstly, it's as Stuart said, it's the first time for any of the committee of SAGE to give a presentation, and it's the first time I've done a presentation on SAGE, so it might be a bit clunky and things might go wrong, so please bear with me. I'd also like to say that I am no expert in archaeology. I am just an interested amateur. And I've been interested in Egyptology and archaeology since I first visited Egypt, which was about 1987. And since that time, I've been back on 3 further occasions and done a lot of touring around Egypt. Last time I went was, I think, in 2004. So what really piqued my interest in it was a program that I saw on television in about the year 2000. It was a program called It Ain't Necessarily So, and I don't know whether any of you can remember that far back, but it was presented by a gentleman by the name of John McCarthy. And you will probably all remember John McCarthy, as he was one of the Beirut hostages, and he was held a hostage in Beirut. He was a journalist held in hostage in Beirut for a number of years. And when he said that when he was a hostage, one of the few things he had that would keep his mind occupied was a Bible. So he read through the Bible, and obviously Old and New Testament, and then he produced this program called It Ain't Necessarily So. And the gist of the program was to debunk everything that was written in the Old Testament, or what we would call the Torah, or the Tanakh, and try and prove, even with the help of some Israeli archaeologists, that nothing in the Bible was true, nothing in the Tanakh was true, because there was no archaeological evidence for it, using the time scales that they had. Now, as an Orthodox Jew brought up in Gateshead, I was taught to believe that the Torah was the word of God, written by God. And here were these archaeologists and Jewish archaeologists as well, saying that the Torah was not written at the hand of by Moshe on instructions from God, but was written much later, about 1,000 years later, by Ezra, who compiled a series of folk tales after the Babylonian Exodus and when people were returning from Babylon back to Israel. And it was purely to unite peoples who'd been separated, to give them a history of their culture. So I started looking at this, and one of the things I found out quite early on was that there is a great discrepancy in timescales between what you would call the Egyptian chronology and the chronology that's written in the Chumash in the first part of Bereshit, where it gives a whole list of ages of people who were born and when they had their children, and according to the Torah, there was a period of, excuse me while I look at my notes, there was a period of about 1,000 years between Adam and Joseph. And if we look at the Egyptian chronology, that would put Joseph and then Moshe at the time of the 19th dynasty, the time of Ramesses II. And a lot of places you will look at, a lot of Chumoshim, even the Hertz Chumash, will say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramesses II. I don't believe it is, because the period of Ramesses II was a period when there was great unity in Egypt, and Egypt was a very strong country, and there is no indication whatsoever at the time of Ramesses II that we could have been slaves. So I would like to go on to more detail, and I'm going to try, if I can, and share a screen and hopefully have a PowerPoint presentation. There we go. Can you all see that? I hope you can.
Yeah, it's okay, Leslie.
Okay, great. Except it's not moving. There we go. I'm going to try and present the events, as I say, in biblical order. We get different events, some archaeological evidence, some photographs which were taken more recently, probably the latest ones being 2004, and a number of Bible theories, and some different theories might contradict. The whole question comes about whether we believe in miracles. Now, I'm not trying to look to prove or disprove miracles. Do I personally believe in miracles? Yes. But I also believe, and it actually it does mention this in the Talmud, that God uses natural events wherever possible for performing miracles. I mean, for example, I would consider the formation of the State of Israel a miracle, in as much as that a very small country defeated much greater military force. But of course, it was covered in a military battle, which was, if you like, some people would say was a natural event, and I would say was a miracle. So you could think of this as proving or disproving miracles. It's up to you. But also, I believe that the timing is critical, because events follow one to another, and for them to have happened in that order, I think was also a miracle. So first, I just want to show you a little map of the Cairo, the Nile Delta, which is the area of Goshen where the children of Israel settled after the time of Joseph. Well, when they came down, when Joseph was the vizier. And as you can see, this is an area which is, the Nile is the main river, as you know, in Egypt. And when it comes to the Nile Delta, it splits into various tributaries which feed out of the Mediterranean. And this gives them a very fertile part of Egypt, which is where most of their food crop comes from, or did in those days, certainly, although there was some food production in the Upper Nile area. So let's look first at the story of Joseph. Did Joseph actually exist? Was Joseph a real person? Well, if we talk about that, it says in the Torah that Joseph was sold by his brothers and for 20 pieces of silver. Now we know from Mesopotamian records of the similar period of the time of Joseph that the going rate for a slave, a male slave, was around about 20 shekels of silver. If, on the other hand, the Torah was compiled, if you like, much later by Ezra, we know that from archaeological, again from Mesopotamian and Babylonian records, that the going price for a slave at that time was 120 shekels of silver. So Ezra would not have known the fact that Joseph would have been sold for 20 shekels. It wouldn't have been something he would have known that much detail about. We also have a situation whereby when Joseph came to Egypt, he was bought by somebody called Potiphar. They have found, archaeological evidence has found the tomb of a 12th or 13th dynasty military commander called Potipare, and it's known from his tomb that he had a country estate in a town called Iona, and he was also governor of the main prison in Memphis, and his wife was Nofret. So we know the story of Joseph being accused of attempted rape of his wife, and Joseph being thrown into jail and eventually becoming almost assistant governor of the jail. Now, if you were a slave and you were accused of molesting your master's wife, I'm sure in those days it would have been instant death. It seems likely that Potiphar or Potipare knew of his wife's dalliances and moved Joseph to another position. As I said, he was governor of the prison, moved him to that position to keep him out of harm's way. And similarly, with the years of famine, the years of plenty and the years of famine, there are Nile records. The Egyptians were very, very keen to keep records of the flooding of the Nile, because that was what they used to fertilize their fields and give enough water for the harvest and thus the Egyptian economy. We know that in the 13th dynasty there are records in the reign of King Amenhotep III, that there was a 7-year period when the Nile was approximately 4 meters higher than the average, and this would have allowed them to fertilize more fields and thus have a greater harvest. And of course, this is what Joseph used to store the extra grain. However, in the following 7 years of this king's rule, we find something totally different. Now, this would be the 7 years of famine. Now, when you think about a famine, what normally comes to mind is the fact that you would have a lack of rain, and this would cause a famine because there'd be no rain for the crops to grow. Egypt was totally different. Egypt didn't rely on rain for the water for the Nile. The waters for the Nile come from 6,000 kilometers away on the borders of Uganda and Tanzania on Lake Victoria, and all that's for the White Nile, and the Blue Nile that comes from the rain on the Ethiopian highlands. So it gets its water from a long way away. So the problem was not the fact that they didn't have enough water, but they had too much water, because the 7 years of famine, according to the Nile records, they had approximately 9.3 meters extra level of the Nile, and this would have flooded the whole of the Nile Delta and therefore the water would have been, the ground would have been waterlogged, and they would not have been able to plant crops for the following year. Thus, they wouldn't have had any harvest, and this was the cause of the famine. So we can reckon that, we can see that from the Egyptian records themselves. Now, after Joseph died, and Joseph died at the age of 120, he'd been in Egypt for 103 years, because he went when he was 17. I would imagine that Ephraim and Manasseh and some other of the children of Israel would have had positions of power, and then Joseph and his brothers died, and the people multiplied because they were living in Goshen, which was a very, very prosperous area. There was a change of dynasty from 12th to 13th dynasty, and a new king came to power, and he was concerned, as it says in the Torah, there are too many Israelites in our country. If we don't outsmart them, their families will keep growing larger. And he was concerned that the children of Israel would, in fact, outnumber the number of ethnic Egyptians. And as I said, this is the area that they lived in Goshen, Avris, Sukkot, Etam. That was the area that they lived. I'll come back to Tanis in a little while. What I would also mention is that about Joseph, whether there's any archaeological evidence. They have found in the last, I think, 20 years, a burial tomb near Avris with a what they have for major, like pharaohs or viziers, they would have what they called a mortuary temple, where they would pray to the statue of the person buried there. And this is something that they found. This is believed to be a statue of Joseph. You can see that he's wearing a coat of many colors, and he's not dressed in a similar way to ethnic Egyptians. And it is believed that this is one of the few statues of Joseph that has been found. Okay, so coming on to that, the king puts the Hebrews into slavery. And at the time, slavery was more of an artisan class. So they'd be builders and they'd be carpenters and things like that, working for the king. They would be paid a slight salary, but they would be indentured servants, not rather than slaves at that time. They wouldn't have been on a chain gang of slaves, as you would have seen in things like Cecil B. DeMille's films. And they definitely did not build the pyramids. Whenever you see anything that the Jews built the pyramids, we didn't. The pyramids were built a lot earlier and have nothing to do with us. They built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses. I don't believe that this is, whether it was called Ramses at the time or the Torah calls it Ramses. But it had nothing to do with Ramses II, who was the king a few hundred years later. Although they were indentured servants, they would probably all have been oppressed, and the slavery, if you like, or the servitude would have got more severe as the years went on, and it probably lasted 80 to 100 years, the period of slavery. And they have found archaeological evidence in the Avris region of houses packed very close together, very, very close, almost like a ghetto. And it was so tightly packed that they had to do burials under the floors of the houses. And they found from some of the skeletons serious health issues such as malnutrition, stunted growth, and the average life expectancy of a woman at the time would have been 30 years, and the average male life expectancy would have been something in the region of 34 years. Avris was the seat of power of the pharaohs of the 13th dynasty, and a few hundred years later, Ramesses II moved the entire city to Tanis, which was I showed you on the map before. It wasn't. He didn't want to have it at Avaris. It was getting old, and he built a new city. Nothing remains of Avaris now, or very little. But Tanis, there are still some archaeological evidence, and you can see a statue there of Ramesses II. So then we come to the slavery and the killing of the firstborn males. Why the males? Why firstborn? Well, it's not firstborn males, so killing Jewish male children. Why male children, not female children? Well, they possibly thought that the male children, obviously, as they grew older, could form an insurrection, and they were more concerned about that. And also the fact that they used the female slaves in the fields and as maids in the houses, so they possibly felt that they were more useful than the males. And I'm sure you ladies would say much the same thing. In fact, when they've looked at graves around the Avaris region, they've found significantly more female adult skeletons than male adult skeletons for that period. So it sort of, again, archaeological evidence that the killing of the baby boys did occur probably. So then we come to the birth of Moses. She later had Moses' mother had a baby boy, which she could no longer keep hidden. She made a basket out of reeds and covered it with tar and put him in a basket and placed it in the Nile. And one of the king's daughters came to take a bath in the river. She saw the basket in the tall grass and sent one of her young women to pull it out of the water. This was around about 1510 BCE, but that's not the only story of a hero being placed in a basket in the river. About 100 or 150 years earlier, there were Chronicles of Gilgamesh had been written. This is in Mesopotamia. And there is a story of Sargon the Great, one of the early rulers of Mesopotamia, having a similar beginning. His mother, who was a priestess, sorry, put Sargon in a basket. He sailed down the Euphrates, was rescued by a gardener of the king's palace, and he eventually grew up to become the king of Mesopotamia. So therefore, that story may have been known to, probably would have been known to everybody in that area, and it's possible one of the reasons why they decided to put Moshe in a basket in the Nile to save him. The baby was found by Pharaoh's daughter and given the name Moses. Now, Moses is not a Hebrew name, it's an Egyptian name, and there are many Egyptians have a variant as part of their name. There's Tutmoses and Dudimose, who were the pharaohs of Egypt, and other people have had the same name as well. Moses was brought up as a member of the royal household. He would have been educated as a prince. He would have been able to read and write, studied history, and trained as a warrior. And then we have the story of Moses having to flee. It says in Shemot, in chapter 2, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were hard at work, and he saw an Egyptian beating one of them. Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. When the king heard what Moses had done, the king wanted to kill him, but Moses escaped and went to the land of Midian. Now, why should the king want to kill Moses? He would not have been, and Pharaoh would not have been in the least interested in the life of a slave master or an overseer, far too lowly down the pecking order. What he was probably more concerned is that Moshe was becoming too popular, possibly more popular than his own son and heir. And he was concerned that Moshe might be able to unite the Hebrews and the Egyptians and take over the throne. So the death of the Egyptian overseer was just probably an excuse that the king was looking for to try and get rid of this interloper. So where did Moshe go to? He went to the area of Mount Sinai, as you can see on the map here. He went that far simply because the Midianites lived there, and they were outside Egyptian control. Egypt controlled a whole area of the Middle East, right up to Lebanon at the time, and he obviously had to get away to somewhere that was outside of Egyptian control, and that part of if you like, Sinai was not at that time under Egyptian control. And this is the area around there. It's now called Jebel Musa, or Moshe's Mountain, which is of course Mount Sinai, and it's a very hilly and protected area, and difficult obviously for the Egyptians to conquer at the time. You can see they could live quite happily in the valleys around there. And then we have the story of the burning bush. One day Moshe was taking care of the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro, and an angel appeared to him from a burning bush. And Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but not burning up. And God replied, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals. The ground where you're standing is holy." And this site is now marked by St. Catherine's Monastery. And even today, there is supposedly a bush, which is said to be where the burning bush was. And you have to take your shoes off if you go to see it. And this is St. Catherine's Monastery at the site of, allegedly, the burning bush. Then Moses returned to Egypt. God tells Moses at the burning bush to go back to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. Bearing in mind, Moshe had been in Midian for 40 years with his father-in-law. He had completely changed, and he was concerned about the fact that he was slow of speech. So his brother Aaron came out to meet him, and they then went to see Pharaoh. Now, there's Egyptian records show that there's a tradition for the king to receive petitions from local leaders each spring, and it's likely that Moshe would have used this opportunity to see the king. But who was the king, and how do we know? As I said before, it's commonly thought that the king at the time would have been Ramesses II, and that's only because if you look at the records of the Egyptian kings, it puts Ramesses II roughly at the time of Moshe, which means that the pharaoh who adopted Moshe would have been Ramesses II's father, Seti I. And this is popularized in such films as The Prince of Egypt and others. And it comes also from the fact that in the Torah it says that the slaves worked on the city of Ramesses. But that is, to my way of thinking, that is not, I don't feel that Ramesses II could have been the king. As I said before, Ramesses, at the time of Ramesses and the time of Seti in that 19th dynasty, it was a very prosperous, very settled period when Egypt was a very, very strong country. And there is no records anywhere at that time of there being any insurrection, any problems, any plagues, any reduction in military prowess or anything like that. And then another reason that I would say that I don't believe this is because Ramesses II's son was called Mernafta, and he only ruled for 10 years. Now, there is a stela, a stone tablet, which was found in 1897, I think, which by Flanders Petrie, which is now in the Cairo Museum, and which I have seen. And this tablet talks about the battles of Mernafta. As I said, he lived for 10 years after Ramesses II. And on this tablet talks about the battles of Mernafta, mainly about battles in Libya. However, the last 3 lines are very interesting, because this tablet, in addition to be called the tablet of Mernafta, is also called the Israel tablet, because it states in the last 3 lines, Gaza and Ashkelon are defeated, Israel is no more, his seed is wasted. In other words, he is talking about a battle against defeating Israel in battle. Now, as he was only king 10 years after Ramesses II, Israel would have been, or the children of Israel would have still been in the wilderness at the time of Manafta. They would not have been in Israel, and therefore they couldn't have been in a battle with him. The final reason, which clinches it for me, is, as I said before, obviously we know the story of Moshe being put into the basket and sent down the river and rescued by the princess. At the time of Ramesses II, the royal palace was not in the area where the Israelites lived. It had moved from Avaris to Tanis, and 25 miles away roughly, and therefore could not have been, I don't believe, nobody would have been in Avaris, and therefore there would be no princess to rescue Moshe. That's why I don't believe that Ramesses' dynasty was the dynasty of the Exodus. Who was the king? After much thought, this is the one that I think would have been the king. He's got a long name, but we'll just use his second part, Dudimose. He was crowned in about 1450, and he was the last king of the 13th dynasty, and the last king of what's known as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was a period of that's not a lot known about it. It is a period when, between the massive building projects of the early pharaohs, the pyramids and such like, and the later New Kingdom of Ramesses, etc., where you had all the massive temples and tombs being built, it was a very quiet dynasty. It was often split between two different kings, one ruling Upper Egypt, one ruling Lower Egypt, and it was not a strong period in Egyptian history. And his reign ended with the country suffering significant number of natural disasters, were they the plagues, which brought down the country and enabled the Hyksos to take over the country. The Hyksos were marauders from Saudi Arabia, and they took over the country, and that could be because the Egyptian army had been destroyed at the crossing of the sea. So there we go. Now we come on to the plagues. Moses and Aaron obeyed the Lord. Aaron held out his stick and struck the Nile, and the king's officials watched. The river turned to blood, the fish died, and water smelled so bad that none of the Egyptians could drink it. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. Now, they have now found, or there is in a museum in Leiden in the Netherlands, a papyrus, a paper which is known as the Ipuwer papyrus. It's around about 1400 BCE, which is the same sort of period, and it talks about the Nile turning to blood. And it says, the plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere, the river is blood. Now, it could have been blood, or it could have been possibly the red algae. Now, this is something that is still common, well, not common, but it's still around today. There was a situation in America about 10 years ago in Arkansas and Arizona, where it was a very hot period, and the lakes and slow-moving rivers were infected by this red algae, and this red algae is toxic. It produces a toxin similar to red ants, apparently, and it can kill fish. So it could be that this red algae covered the Nile. It wasn't something they'd seen before, so obviously this was something that the Egyptians would have thought was the Nile turning to blood, and of course the fish would die because the water became toxic, and it particularly affected slow-moving water such as the Nile Delta, where the Nile is at a much slower pace, and there's lots of lakes and such like there. So we then come on to the other plagues, the frogs. The frogs would leave the polluted water and invade the towns. And then you'd get the gnats, which was because of the dead fish and the dead frogs. Cattle would die because of drinking infected water. You'd have flies feeding on the corpses of the dead frogs and the dead cattle and such like. And the flies would carry disease such as anthrax, which could be passed on to humans and cattle through bites and boils and lesions. And then we come on to the 7th, 8th, and 9th plague, and the papyrus in the Netherlands records storms devastating the Egyptian economy, storms, hail, and lightning, and also records locusts brought on the wind, and a sandstorm from the desert, which could be the darkness. If anybody's seen a sandstorm in Israel, you know it does blot out the sun. And the last plague, the death of the firstborn, when at midnight the Lord killed the firstborn sons of every Egyptian family, from the son of the king to the son of every prisoner in jail. That night the king and his officials and everyone else in Egypt got up and started crying bitterly. In every Egyptian home someone was dead. Why the firstborns? Well, it could well be that in a lot of early civilizations, the firstborn always got a larger portion. Even in Jewish law, the firstborn got a double inheritance to the rest of the family, and it could well be that the firstborn got a double share of food, particularly if food was in short supply. The firstborn one would be the one to be given the food first, and it's likely that he was infected if the food was poisonous, or from the various cattle disease that have been. If the food was poisonous, it's likely that they would die because they would get a larger proportion of the food and therefore a bigger proportion of the poison. And then after the king had finally let the people go, the Lord did not lead them through the Philistine territory, which is the Gaza area. That's where the Philistines lived. Though that was the shortest way, God had said if they are attacked, they may decide to return to Egypt. So he let them around through the desert and towards the Red Sea. So that is the area of Egypt that they lived in Goshen. And you can see where I've marked on the map where it says line of forts. There is an Egyptian, that archaeological evidence has found a series of forts protecting the Egyptian flank at that side. And if the children of Israel would have gone that way, they would have met with an Egyptian army that they would have had to fight. And as they were still slaves at that time, it was unlikely that they would have been able to have the courage to fight the Egyptians. And this is now called Tel El Hebu. And these are some of the archaeological evidence of this line of forts in the desert. And then we come on to their movement. After the Israelites left Ramesses, they camped at Sukkot, and from there they moved the camp to Etam on the desert, and there they turned back to Pi-Hahiroth, east of Baal Zephon, and camped near Migdol, and left Pi-Hahiroth and crossed the Red Sea. So this is the direction that they went. They went from Avris to Sukkot to collect more of the children of Israel who lived there, then down to Etam to collect some more, up to Baal Zephon to collect some more. And then you can see when they were in the north point near Baal Zephon, they could have crossed over, but they went south. God tells Moses to travel south away from the natural crossing towards the land of the Philistines and where the Egyptian forts were. And the people left Sukkot and camped at Etam, on the borders of Egypt, near the desert. And during the day, the Lord went ahead of the people in a thick cloud, and during the night, he went ahead of them in a flaming fire. That way, the Lord could lead them at all times, whether day or night. Now, that is a very, obviously, a pillar of cloud behind them, or a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire to lead them through day and night, could only be a miracle. However, at exactly the same time, or more or less within a few score years, could well be in the same time, the biggest explosion the world has ever known is a volcanic explosion, what is now Santorini. And this happened about the same time, and there would have been smoke visible at night, and there would have been flame visible at night. So as the children of Israel moved, changing direction, traveling to north and traveling south, obviously there would have been a pillar of cloud or smoke in front of them, behind them, as it was. Now, it could have been Santorini, or it could have just been a definite miracle. I'll leave you to decide on that yourself, but this is Santorini as it is now. Now we come to the crossing of the Red Sea. Moses stretched his arm over the sea, and the Lord sent a strong east wind that blew all night until there was dry land where the water had been. The sea opened up, and the Israelites walked through on dry land with a wall of water on each side. Moses stretched out his arm, and at daybreak the water rushed towards the Egyptians. They tried to run away, but the Lord drowned them in the sea. So this is the area. Now, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, round here, you've got the Red Sea, and you've got the Gulf of Suez, which is a part of the Red Sea, and then you've got the Gulf of Aqaba leading up to Etzion Geber, which is where Elat is now, and you can see where the Mount Sinai is. Now, it's possible that they could have traveled far enough south. I don't know if you can see on your screen where there are three rivers leading into the Gulf of Suez. It's possible that these are gullies leading into the Gulf through rocky terrain. It's possible that they could have gone through there. And in fact, they have found on one of these, I'm not sure which one it is, they have found a raised area of sand, which could be a pathway through, and they found parts of chariots across there. So it's possible that this could have been the crossing that they made. I think not. I tend to believe that they would have crossed around this area, the northern area, which is a marshy area, and that's simply because the word Red Sea is a mistranslation from the original Hebrew into Greek. It's called in the Torah Yam Suf, which means a sea of reeds, not the Red Sea. And that area around there is a marshy area, which was the Sea of Reeds. Depending on the height of the Gulf of Suez, it would have been flooded or not, as the case may be. There's nothing much you can see there now, because it's now the Suez Canal. That's where they've built the Suez Canal through at that point. Now, it mentions that God blew a strong wind, and if the ground was marshy and shallow, and a strong wind would blow the waters off, and it would still be slightly marshy, but people could cross on foot. However, it would be impossible for chariots to cross, and heavily armed Egyptians and things like that. So that could be one of the areas, and one of the reasons they crossed. Alternative, obviously, as I mentioned before, there was this explosion at Santorini that could have caused a tsunami, which pulled the waters back to allow the children of Israel to cross, and the tidal wave struck back afterwards and killed the Egyptians. And there is a possible evidence of that, because there is a layer of sea deposits found many miles inland. I mentioned about Tel El Habub before, the line of fortune. You can see on the screen here, there's white deposits which are consistent with salt, with sea salt. And it's possible that that might have been one of the reasons how the Egyptians died. But I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself. After the Israelites left the Red Sea, Moses led them through the desert of Shur for 3 days. And before finding water, they did find water at Marah, but it was bitter. And that's how it got its name, because Marah is bitter, as in Morrow. bitter herbs. The people complained and said, Moses, what are we going to drink? And Moses asked the Lord for help. And the Lord told him to throw a piece of wood into the water. Moses did so, and the water became fit to drink. And this is Marah. And these are the great bitter lakes in the Sinai desert. So there were saltwater lakes there at the time. Later, the Israelites came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, so they camped there. That's where Elim was on the map, and that's what it's like at the present moment. Palm trees and wells. So again, it was an area that they could get water. They left Elim and camped near the Red Sea, then turned east and camped along the western edge of the Sinai desert. From there, they went to Dophkah, Alush, and Rephidim, where they had no water. So there we are. That is the Red Sea. That is where they went. They went down the Gulf of Suez and got to a certain point. Now, they could have continued down the Gulf of Suez. Why didn't they continue down the Gulf? Why did they go inland? Because at that point, you've got what is known as Pharaoh's Hot Springs. And when you get there, that's what you see. A mountain range coming right down to the coast. So they could not have continued on their journey along the coast. They had to go inland. Now, Dophkah is a remote area. It was the site of turquoise mines, and it was likely that there was, it's now called Sabrit el Kedim, and it's likely that there would have been slaves taken there to mine the turquoise or lapis lazuli, and it's probable that Moshe would have sent not the whole of the children of Israel there, but a select band of warriors to rescue the prisoners or the slaves in the mines. And that is where Dophkah was. And this is the lead up to Dophkah. As you can see, it's quite hilly, quite mountainous, and it would not have been somewhere that the whole of the children of Israel would have gone to. It would have been a select band of warriors. And at the top of Dophkah, there is a temple to Hathor, which is the cow goddess of the Egyptians. And I'll come on to that in a moment, why that's important. But she was the cow goddess that they worshipped, the Egyptians worshipped in that area. And there is a stele carved in the mountain near the temple, and on that stele there is early Hebrew writing, and it indicates that there were Hebrews, probably slaves, at Dophkah, and Joshua would have rescued them and taken them with the rest of the Hebrews to Alush. And then we have the story of the manna and the quails, where they complained to Moses and Aaron that we lived in Egypt, we could at least eat bread and meat that we wanted, but you have brought us into the desert to starve. And that evening, a lot of quails came and landed everywhere in the camp. And the next morning, after dew had gone, the desert was covered with thin flakes that looked like frost. And that is where Alush is. And that's now called Wadi Mukatab. And the valley contains tamarisk trees, and they get a white sticky dew formed on them in the morning, which is a secretion of microbes, and that drops to the desert floor like white edible flaky substance. And this could have been the manna that's mentioned in the Torah. And the valley is also on the migratory path for quails, and they migrate through that valley today, and Bedouin catch them and use them for food as well. And Wadi Mukatab, which is, as I say, the name for Alush, is also known, it literally means the valley of writing. And there are many stones covered with ancient Hebrew script. And then from there, they left the desert and moved to Rephidim, and there was no water to drink. And Moses struck the rock, and while the leaders watched, and when the Israelites were at Rephidim, they were attacked by the Amalekites. So that is where Rephidim is, just north of Mount Sinai. And then they left Rephidim, and 2 months after leaving Egypt, they arrived at Mount Sinai, where they set up camp at the foot of the mountain. And that is where Mount Sinai is. And in the whole of that mountainous region, there is a plain called the Plain of El Raha, where the Israelites camped. It was a large flat plain. The rest of the area is mountainous, and there is a large flat plain at that area. And the small mountain right in the middle in the distance, here, that is Mount Sinai. And that's a bit closer up picture. It's now called Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. And then God told Moses to go up the mountain and stay for a while. And he gave them the 10 Commandments. And that is a photograph of climbing Mount Sinai at night, sunrise over Mount Sinai, and that's what it looks like in the dawn from the top of Mount Sinai. Incidentally, that's a toilet at the top of Mount Sinai, just if you're interested. So they do think about the tourists there. After the people saw that Moshe had been at the mountain for a long time, they went to Aaron and said, "Make us an image of a God who will lead us and protect us," because they thought that Moshe had died. Everybody took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He melted them down and made an idol in the shape of a young bull. And all the people said to one another, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." Why a young bull? Well, as I said, the children, some of the children of Israel had been at Dofka in the mines. They would not have seen the plagues and the miracles of Egypt, and they were in an area where they worshipped the cow god Hathor. So maybe it was they were the ringleaders, because all the Torah calls them the Eruv Rav, which means the hangers-on. It's possible that these were the Eruv Rav, the hangers-on, who convinced the rest of the people to make an idol, the golden calf. And this is the bottom of Mount Sinai. There is now a church there where allegedly Moshe broke the 10 Commandments. And then we come to the point where Moshe asks to see God, and God says, "Anyone who sees my face will die. I'll put you in a crack in the rock and cover your eyes with my hand. Until I have passed by, you will not see my face, but see my back." And Moses came down from Mount Sinai carrying the 10 Commandments. His face was shining brightly. Now, this is a statue of Moses in Rome, and it's meant to depict the light shining from his face. But of course, a lot of people think that the two projections from his forehead are horns, and we've got a similar situation in a painting in the Vatican Museum. They're not horns, of course. They're meant to show the light shining from Moshe's face, but that's why medieval Christians thought that Jews had horns. And they went from there, and they traveled up from Mount Sinai. They went up to Etzion Geber, which is Elat, and Kadesh Barnea, where they sent the slaves, and then they moved from there towards Petra. Now, Petra didn't exist as we know it today, because the Nabateans didn't exist, hadn't existed at the time. They hadn't built Petra, but Petra was a perfect place for them to rest, because it was a sheltered valley where they could be fairly safe. It's quite hidden, and it's between Edom and Midian, and both of these tribes are from Abraham, so they were related, so they felt safe camping between Edom and Midian. And then when just before entering the land of Israel, after 40 years in the desert, the people skirted round the territory of Edom, because Edom was, as I said, a related nation, and they refused. Moshe was told not to attack them, but to go round them. So they went round them, and the people complained. And the Lord sent a poisonous snake that bit and killed many of them. And Moses prayed, and God told Moshe to make a snake out of bronze, place it on top of a pole, and anyone who gets bitten can look at the snake and they won't die. And that's where they were going. And even today we use the bronze snake as a sign of healing on ambulances. The snake and the staff is a symbol of healing even today. Sometimes later Moshe went up to Mount Nebo. This was just before he died. He went up to Mount Nebo, and he looked across the Jordan River to Jericho, and he saw the land, but he wasn't allowed to enter it. And Moses died in Moab on Mount Nebo, just as Hashem had said. And this is a stained glass window on the top of Mount Nebo with the death of Moshe. So basically, that is the end of my tale. So you can believe in the miracles of Exodus. You can believe in historic migration from Egypt to Israel. And I think there's enough evidence to suggest that something happened 3,500 years ago. Thank you very much. Here ended the first lesson.
Leslie, thank you very much indeed. I'm hoping that Rabbi Nick is around just to get us back on focus. I suppose I would say that's to... No, he's there obviously. So I think, you know, when we talk about sage as it's never too late to learn, your talk has been indicative of that, because I've learned so much about the journey of Moses and the Israelites in the desert, their journey. I think it'll fill some gaps in on for Seder night for me. So I think it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for that. It's fascinating, and you obviously work very hard at putting that all together. And great admiration of your detailed knowledge on all that you've been telling us about this afternoon. So, has anybody got any questions that you would ask to Leslie? If you could just wave a bit, because I can't.
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, hello. I might have known. Hello, Shlomo.
Uncle Leslie, that was fascinating. It must have taken you hours and hours to do all that research. I'm very impressed. However, I can't accept your theory because of one significant omission, and I'm markedly surprised at your lack of historical focus. Not once did you mention Charlton Heston.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I might have known. For those of you who don't know, Shlomo Kryman is a great friend of mine. He is a
liar.
he is a solicitor and a judge, and he will be talking in Sage in August about his life on the bench. Thank you very much. Not that bench. And so I will then heckle him just as he's...
Well, that's the heckle Shlomo.
That's right.
Your chance, Leslie, to get back to him, obviously, because not mentioning Charlton Heston was...
Not mentioning... Well, I didn't mention Charlton Heston or even Charlton Athletic. But I did mention Cecil B. DeMille.
Leslie, I have a question, Leslie.
Yes.
Thank you for all your research. It's resulted in a marvelous, very interesting hour. I wonder, how has your research on the history of these movements affected your religious view on God giving to the Torah on Mount Sinai?
It hasn't affected my religious views. as I said, I still believe in miracles and giving the Torah on Mount Sinai. But I believe that the miracles were slightly covered in natural events. So it wasn't an out and out miracle because when we think about the Torah, we think that the plagues happened one after the other immediately. It didn't. It took a period of 4 years for that to happen, and that's mentioned in the Talmud. But I believe that miracles, that God's miracles can be miracles, but they're hidden in natural events. So I don't think it has changed my mind on my belief. However, I would say one thing. I didn't show the photograph here, but there is one of the temples, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, built at the time of Seti I, which is, I must admit, after the time of Moshe. But there is a temple there where, when you go in, there is an altar with a ramp leading up to it, and there is an outer court with a table where the Egyptians would have brought their produce, and then there is an inner section which only the high priest of the Egyptians was allowed to go once a year, and that is very, very similar to the tabernacle in the desert. So whether the Egyptian temple was built on the blueprint of the tabernacle, or whether the tabernacle was built on a blueprint of an Egyptian temple, I don't know, but there is a lot of similarities between the two.
Sandra Connolly has a question.
Hi, Sandra. You're
You need
muted.
to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I very much believe that the Santorini volcano happened. But isn't the miracle is that it happened then, when it was most needed?
Yes, I that is what I would totally agree with you on that, Sandra. I believe that the miracles are the time scale, the fact that things happened together at the same time, or within that period, that the river had this algae, and that the algae caused the fish to die, and the flies fed on the carcass of the dead fish, and then caused plague to cattle and things like that. And yes, and Santorini, and if you say the crossing of the Yam Suf was caused by a tsunami, again, it all happened at the same time. Why did the tsunami bring the waters back when the Egyptians were crossing and not when the Hebrews were crossing? Yes, I agree with you. That's the miracle.
Apparently, the water parts every so many hundred years like that.
Yeah.
And the miracle is that then that it should happen.
Exactly. I would agree with you on that, Sandra. That's my reading of it as well. I don't know if Rabbi Nick would agree with that reading, but I would.
Yes, we'll stick together.
Exactly, definitely.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Leslie from John Ty. Leslie, thank you very much indeed.
Hello,
very
John.
informative, very interesting.
Thank you, John.
Couple of points. As a current student of archaeology, certainly it's still very Christocentric, and to try and shake the belief that Ramesses was not the pharaoh of the Exodus is certainly very hard. And also there's a large opinion that say, well, the Exodus never happened. But I'm just going to throw out a couple of points. There's a growing belief that actually the pharaoh of the Exodus was actually Akhenaten. Everything seems to fit. The first son of the pharaoh was honored to the main god Ra. So you end up with Ra Moshe, was Ramesses. The second son had the honorific of Tut. So you had Tutmoshe, Akhenaten's grandfather, and you had Tutankhamun, the second son of Akhenaten. So have a nice think there. Other things were that the other thing I'll also throw out at you is that Ramesses has a large inscription detailing the Battle of Kadesh, where he smites the Hittites with iron chariots. And it looking back the other day at the book of Judges with Deborah and Barak, one wonders, was this the same battle? There's so many coincidences here. And the last one, which is a very unpopular theory in archaeology, which is sociology, archaeology. Who, other than a slave nation, would have come up with the Torah? Who else in the ancient world would have had the idea of having a day off? So I'm leaving that, I'm not making any opinions, just leaving that for people to think about.
That's very interesting, John. Akhenaten, very, very interesting character. He was the Egyptian, for those who don't know, Akhenaten was the Egyptian pharaoh who believed in one God. He believed that the Egyptians should scrap all of their pantheon of gods and just worship the sun god, the Aten, as it was called, the sun god. And it's unlikely that Akhenaten would have been the pharaoh of slavery because he, like the children of Israel, believed in one God. So he certainly wouldn't have enslaved them. There is a theory that Akhenaten was actually Joseph, or that Joseph may have been his vizier, because he believed he changed from the Egyptian pantheon of gods to one god. But I don't think he would have been the pharaoh of slavery. But if you say, on the other hand, if you say Akhenaten was either Joseph or Joseph was his vizier, then it does fit in pretty well with the 19th dynasty, Seti and Ramesses, being the pharaohs of the Exodus. Because Akhenaten and then Tutankhamun, his son, were the last of the 18th dynasty, leading on to the 19th dynasty. So I would disagree with you on Akhenaten being involved. I mean, he would have known about monotheism from at the time from the Israelites and other people who traveled around at the time. So I wouldn't think, to my mind anyway, I don't think he is the pharaoh either of Joseph or of leading up towards the Exodus. As regards the Battle of Kadesh, well, it would in fact, if you go by my theory of the Exodus being the 13th dynasty, then the Battle of Kadesh could well link in with Deborah and Barak on timescale.
Thank you. Anybody else? Doesn't look like. Let's see.
Can I, Martin Moss, can you hear me? Fascinating, Leslie. Thank you very much indeed. There was actually in March 2015 a very, very well structured lecture given by somebody called Joshua Berman. Joshua Berman, who wrote a very good thesis. If any, it is available on the net. Very much supporting the possibility of this Exodus. He's not a particularly religious person, so it's done from a historical point of view. But if anybody's interested, it's available on the net. It's Joshua Berman's lecture of March 2015. Well worth reading, beautifully structured, and not that long. And it really does give every reason for us to know and understand that the Exodus actually took place.
Can you, Martin, do you remember who he said is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Or do you not remember that?
I haven't got it in front of me, and
Okay.
I'm not being an archaeologist or a historian, I can't remember, but I do have a copy somewhere and I'll try and find it. I did print it up, but I found it really helpful for me to understand what went on and to enhance my belief in that the information in the Torah is, in essence, absolutely as things happened.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, one of the other, coming back to John Ty's thought about the period of chariot, it was the 13th dynasty and the Hyksos that introduced the use of chariots in warfare. Prior to that, there'd been quite heavy ceremonial chariots, but at that time, that's when they became used in warfare, and that's why when you see in the 13th dynasty, when you see that when they're crossing the Red Sea, the chariots stuck in the as us Geordies would have said, got themselves stuck in the clarts or in the mud, so they couldn't get out. It was because they were still quite heavy.
The lecture was actually entitled "Was There an Exodus?"
Okay. I'll look it up.
Martin?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Hello, Henry.
You mentioned Joshua Berman.
Yes.
I'm just reading a book of his called Animamin.
Oh.
And it's a very interesting book, a bit complicated, but in fact he goes over this business of the Exodus historically and everything else.
Right.
You might like to borrow it when I've finished it in a couple of years' time. And as another point, your book in the beginning has just arrived, so I'm going to read that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Right.
Thank you, and lovely talk, Leslie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Leslie?
Yep.
Hi, it's David.
Hello. What are you doing on there, David?
Hi there.
Well,
Hi there.
Hi, Leslie. Forget the social thing. And I missed the first half of the talk, and I thought what we did here, without being patronising of a friend of 57 years, I thought was brilliant. But can I ask? Can we ask?
Okay, David. I'm going to start all over again just for you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, don't bring your notes when you come round for dinner. No. Can I ask the question?
Yeah.
And the point we both picked up on is the timing of some of these miracles, or whatever anybody else wants to call them. But doesn't that suggest that today the coronavirus is yet another miracle? Because if you talk about timing, the world was in turmoil from climate change, whether you believe it or not, but the world was in arms, in turmoil over climate change. A lot of capitalism was going wrong. A lot of people have the wrong values. They're only interested in the commercial or the property or the wealth that they've got, and they're not thinking of other people. Hasn't this turned us round into a society that by and large, I think is a lot more compassionate? A society is rethinking its values on material things. And also you just have to look at the lack of pollution, and maybe this is a start to change something. The fact that we haven't got the airlines flying, and they will come back, but all the prognosis is they will not come back to this level for years and years to come. How do you say this isn't a miracle because it isn't related to a religious group? You know, it affects everybody. Isn't it under the same criteria?
I think the trouble is with miracles, you can only see them in hindsight. I'm sure that... well,
we're looking at it live, though, today.
We are looking at it live. I'm sure in 48, they weren't looking at the battles and saying this is a miracle, but in hindsight, when it was all over, then they realized. I don't know. I mean, it all depends on how people react once we get through this pandemic. If we find a vaccine, whether we revert to being the same selfish type of people that we were before. Not saying that anybody here is selfish or whatever, but generally the community was a me, what's in it for me type of community. Not
Sure.
The world was. If we revert back to that or not. I mean, I'll ask you, David. I mean, would you think, for example, you mentioned about pollution. A lot of, would you think that the company that you were involved with before you retired, would you think they would go back to manufacturing in the UK as opposed to in Sri Lanka? This is how I know a lot about what's happening.
Yeah.
David, you see, folks. Would you think that they would think about the climate and revert to making more sustainable clothes and reverting to manufacturing local to source?
Well, if you take that particular one, bringing it back to the UK would not materially affect anything as far as the ecosystem is concerned. The fact that it was made in a bit further away, and there were transport costs and whatever, but you could argue the other way, and I've argued this passionately when I hear people saying how these countries are exploited. I can only talk from personal experience, and you and I have had this conversation, where we eliminated poverty. At one time, we employed 10,000 people who lived in mud huts, etc., etc. I won't bore the audience with it, who suddenly worked in factories, good conditions, 3 meals a day, food on the table, nice clothes. So we did, and we didn't do it for that reason, let me hastily add, but we brought a lot of comfort and improvement in lifestyle to the people over there. And the reason is, the greed of the unions, without getting political here, didn't allow us and many other countries to produce goods at an economical value. And it wasn't exploiting them, I assure you. The fact they got low wages, the wages were low, but it allowed them to have a much, much better lifestyle than they had before we and other people went abroad. I know some countries still have exploitation, but I'm talking from experience. So I don't think, with hindsight, that would necessarily change.
Fair enough. Okay. We're coming off the subject of Egypt, but okay.
Yeah, I know. we work in a manufacturer in Egypt, actually, and the Israelis do a lot of clothes manufacturing in Egypt, yes, and have built factories there. So we'll finish on that score. All right, we'll talk later. Yeah. We won't hog the limelight.
Indeed.
Talk later.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, Stuart had to leave, unfortunately.
Was he bored?
Yes, he'd had enough of you.
I can understand that. I was going to leave myself. I got bored as well.
Oh, man.
Well, just on behalf of everybody, I want to say thank you so much, Leslie. And now you've set the standard for the whole committee. If any of us ever want to do anything, I think we're going to have a very hard act to follow. So thank you very, very much.
Can I just thank you all for staying the course, and can I remind you that in August to remember to come and heckle Reverend Shlomo Kryman.
Hey. Oh, I didn't know he's got a phone. I haven't got
and also, can I just remind you, next week we have Jonathan Bergwerk, who you all know well, and who is going to be talking about Benjamin Disraeli. Oh. So that should be very interesting too, and we know Jonathan always gives us an interesting talk. Thank you very much, everybody.
Is it called Won't You Come Home Disraeli?
Something like that, Leslie. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Just keep well and stay safe.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.